The Old Testament manuscripts, let's talk about those a minute. In 1776, Benjamin Kennicott listed all of the known manuscripts of the Old Testament and totaled 615 manuscripts at that time. By 1890, there were a total of 731 manuscripts of the Old Testament published worldwide, and the oldest was approximately the 9th century A.D. There were no older manuscripts of the Old Testament prior to approximately the 9th century A.D. And that was about 1,400 years after the prophet Malachi had penned his book. And so skeptics said, well, you can't trust the Bible because the oldest ones we have are from the 9th century. How do we know that that really represents what they penned, 1,500 to 2,000 years ago? And they had a point. In 1890, an astonishing find occurred in the Cairo Geniza Synagogue in Cairo, Egypt. There were 10,000 biblical texts, biblical manuscripts of the Old Testament that were found inside of the synagogue in Egypt. And they were dated between the 10th and the 12th century and compared virtually identically to the previous 700 manuscripts that existed at that time, helping to show that the Bible had been, in fact, transmitted accurately over time. But the real discovery came in 1947, which proved that the Bible indeed has been transmitted through time virtually unchanged, and that is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In March 1947, an Arab shepherd boy was pursuing his lost goat in the Dead Sea, and he found some caves. He threw a rock inside one of the caves, and he heard a sound that sounded like a piece of pottery breaking. Went in there and indeed found the greatest manuscript discovery in history. Thousands of manuscripts were found in 11 different caves. Portions of every book of the Old Testament were discovered except the book of Esther. And scholars believe that these Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a devout sect of Jews, the Essenes, between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. So that pushed the age of existent Bible manuscripts back about 1,200 years from what we had before. And the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the following. The gap between the last prophet Malachi and the existent manuscripts was narrowed from about 1,400 years to only about 150 years. Secondly, examination of the Dead Sea Scrolls has shown that the Old Testament was transmitted accurately from about the 1st century to the 9th century, virtually unchanged. And I'll show you some evidence on that. Dead Sea Scroll Hebrew scholar Geza Vermes said this about the Qumran biblical documents, otherwise known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. He said, the Qumran biblical documents cover the whole Hebrew Bible with the exception of the book of Esther, and are about 1,000 years older than the most ancient codices previously extant. With this newly discovered material at their disposal, experts concerned with the study of the text and transmission of the scriptures are now able to achieve far greater accuracy in their deductions and can trace the process by which the text of the Bible obtained its final shape. Moreover, they are in position to prove that it has remained virtually unchanged for the last 2,000 years. So for the skeptic that says, you can't trust the Bible because, over time, you don't know, things have probably been changed over time. Parts of the books have been lost or changed over time. No, it didn't happen. 2,000 years of transmission or more, and it was virtually unchanged. The manuscripts were. So the Bible is trustable when it comes to knowing that the document you have in your lap is virtually unchanged, the Old Testament, over 2,000 years. I'll talk about the New Testament in a minute. Now, regarding the purity of the text, Norman Geisler also said in his book, A General Introduction to the Bible, of the 166 words in Isaiah 53, there are only 17 letters in question. 10 of these letters are simply a matter of spelling, which does not affect the sense. 4 more letters are minor stylistic variations, such as conjunctions. The remaining 3 letters comprise the word light, which is added in verse 11 and does not affect the meaning greatly. Thus, in one chapter of 166 words, there is only one word, 3 letters, in question after 1,000 years of transmission. And this word does not significantly change the meaning of the passage. So the Bible, the Old Testament, has been transmitted faithfully over time, intact, with virtually no significant change. Now let's talk about the New Testament. The New Testament is the most authenticated book in history in terms of authenticating that it has been transmitted accurately over time. When you look at the New Testament compared to other ancient documents, and you hold it up side by side, there's not a single document on earth that compares with the New Testament in terms of the amount of information to be able to study. Homer's Iliad was written roughly in 800 BC. There are 643 copies, and those copies have been transmitted through time with an accuracy of about 95%. Herodotus, 480 BC, there's 8 copies. Plato's Tetralogies, 427 BC, 7 copies. Caesar's Gallic Wars, 44 BC, 10 copies. But the New Testament, written between 50 and 95 to 100 AD, there's over 25,000 manuscripts, early manuscripts, in Greek and in Latin, with greater than 99.5% purity of the text. William F. Albright, a very famous archaeologist in this century, said in his book, Recent Discoveries in the Bible Lands, "We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book in the New Testament after about 80 AD. Now that is important because if you date the New Testament as being truly a first century document, then we know that the time between the writing of the New Testament and the manuscripts that we have is reliably small, and that's very important in determining whether the document you have in your lap is in fact accurate. And he says that at this point we can date virtually every book by about 80 AD. William F. Albright also said in Christianity Today on January 18th, 1963, "In my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the first century AD." So the New Testament is not a 2nd or 3rd century fabrication, as skeptics would say. Archaeological discoveries in this century have proven that the New Testament is indeed a 1st century document, written within a generation of the death of Jesus and the lives of the apostles, which is very important to determining the accuracy of the text. Sir Frederick Kenyon said this: "The interval then between the dates of the original composition and the earliest existing evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible." He's talking about the New Testament. "And the last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established." That's in his book, The Bible and Archaeology. Many of these men that said these statements were indeed not Christians early in their archaeological careers, but later became convinced that the Bible was indeed a 1st century book which was transmitted accurately over time. It's very important. So for the skeptic that says you can't trust it because it was written hundreds of years after Jesus died, the New Testament, or that it's been corrupted over time, it doesn't fly. It's a very ancient book with better than 90, it's more pure than ivory soap, which is 99.44. So if you can get cleaned really well with ivory soap, imagine what the New Testament can do for you. Now there's another way to prove the ancient state of the New Testament, and that is by the early church fathers. When you take the writings of the 2nd century church fathers and the 3rd century church fathers, and you look at them, the volume of the writings, you can reconstruct the entire New Testament from their quotations except 11 verses. J. Harold Greenlee, in his book Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism, said that quotations from the early church fathers are so extensive that the New Testament could virtually be reconstructed from them without the use of the New Testament manuscripts. Sir David Dalrymple stated, if every ancient manuscript of the New Testament from the 2nd and 3rd century were lost, we could reconstruct the entire New Testament in the writings of the early church fathers except 11 verses. So those that say that the New Testament was written in the 2nd or 3rd century, no way. The very early church fathers quoted it extensively, and you can reconstruct it from their quotations alone. Norman Geisler said in a general introduction to the Bible regarding the New Testament, "Only 400 words in the New Testament are in doubt, whereas 764 lines of Homer's Iliad are questioned. This 5% textual corruption in the Iliad compares with 0.5% of similar emendations in the New Testament." So the New Testament is incredibly pure. It's incredibly ancient and incredibly pure in terms of how it was transmitted through time. So the book that you have in your lap is virtually unchanged compared to 2,000 years ago. You can trust it.